next 10 minutes and do a little carbon footprint leveling. And I want to start by getting just a pulse in the room. How many of you are an emoji 1 when it comes to your familiarity with carbon footprint? You're super new to carbon footprint. Emoji 1. Okay, perfect. You're in the right place. What about emoji 2? You kind of know a little bit? Perfect, okay, lots of hands go up. What about emoji 3? Some carbon experts in the room, wonderful. So we've got a different kind of realm of different familiarities, and I hope by the end of it, everyone will walk away with something a little bit new. So at Clever Carbon, why do we focus on carbon literacy? Well, today when we talk about a single-use flight and a coffee cup, we say those things are bad. Flying is bad, coffee cups are bad. And what that fundamentally tells me is that we lack the ability to understand and make and communicate our choices in a way that we can quantify and measure. And what we try to do is imagine a world where, well, what if instead we could say, coffee cup, around 20 grams of CO2 emissions, maybe a little bit less. Flying for an hour, maybe about 120 kilograms of CO2 emissions. Now we're no longer saying things are good or bad, right or wrong. We're using data and we're being objective. So at Clever Carbon, we create these different resources to help people get carbon literate, and that's where we have a game now. This is game time, and this is serious stuff, so I hope everyone is ready. All right, you have 10 seconds to remember as much as you can on this slide. No cameras, no cameras. All right, so first, really serious question here. What do you think the average carbon footprint of an apple is? And if you remember the potato, you might get this one right. Who says A? B? C? D? Okay, so if you said B, you are correct. The average carbon footprint of an apple in the study was around 35 grams of CO2 emissions. A potato is around 40. A tomato, however, is around 130 grams, because in this study, which was done in the UK, tomatoes are grown in greenhouses, which require more energy, and as a result have a higher carbon footprint. And a bowl of rice, which is 3 tablespoons of rice, is around 330 grams of CO2 emissions, and that's because rice produces methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is 25 times more potent than CO2 over a 100-year scale. All right, next question. A serving of chicken, average serving of chicken. What do you think the average carbon footprint is? If you remember pork, you might get this one right. Who says A? B? C? D? Okay. If you said A, you are correct. The average carbon footprint of a serving of chicken is around 1,300 grams of CO2 emissions. Pork is 1,800. The average vegetarian meal is around 600 grams of CO2 emissions, and the average serving of beef is around 7,700 grams. This is all where you go, Now, no cheating and looking behind you at the coffee menu. What do you think the average carbon footprint of a dairy latte is? Who says A? B? C? D? Okay. A few shy people there, but if you said B, 350 grams, you are correct. Does anyone remember what plain coffee is? 50 grams of CO2 emissions. So really, the majority of the emissions of coffee doesn't actually come from the coffee, but it comes from the dairy. And if we look at a plant-based latte, on average, it's around 140 grams of CO2 emissions for an oat latte. And what about an email? So the average carbon footprint of an email, how many people think A, B, C, and D? Okay, kind of like a little bit all over the place, but the average carbon footprint of an email is around 4 grams of CO2 emissions. As we add attachments, as we add photos, the emissions become higher. So at Clever Carbon, we actually have a policy where instead of sending attachments, we send links to folders. Your IT team is gonna like that because you can also make that more secure. And now you're not creating thousands of redundant copies of files on data centers, which are very energy intensive and require a lot of energy to manufacture the equipment inside. All right, so the average carbon footprint of an individual in Canada is around 14.1 tons, okay? In Canada, if you're one person, 14.1. In the UK, what do you think the average is? How many people say A? B? C? And D? Okay, maybe some of you remembered at the beginning that I did share that the average carbon footprint of an individual in the UK is around 7.7 tons. And this is usually very, very shocking because people feel like the US and the UK are quite similar, but actually Europe in general is much lower, between 5 and 10 per person. What about Vietnam? Average carbon footprint of a person in Vietnam, and let's see some of those hands go up. Don't be shy. How many people say A? B? Ooh. C? And D? Okay. So I'm going to share. The average footprint is B, 2.2 tons, and one flight from New York to Tokyo, just one flight, is 1.8 tons. Now, what about the average carbon footprint in the US? Okay. How many people say A? B? C? D? Okay. So people definitely think it's higher, and you're correct. The average, thankfully, is only 17 and not 33. And you can see a few different countries here just for comparison. And I will mention that most African countries are 1.0 and below. So the current global average in terms of carbon footprint is 6.3 tons. And the UN states that we need to get to 2.1 by 2030. Does anyone remember what their carbon footprint was? Okay. So it's one of those things where you might take the quiz, you kind of remember what it is, but not really, which is why we made the carbon footprint quiz so easy and so simple so that you can always go in and within 2 minutes get the answer. All right, so I'm gonna skip over this one here, but I want to also kind of train the mind to think a little bit because we don't always have data. And when we don't, how do we tell between two things what has a higher carbon footprint? So we've got wired headphones, A, and wireless headphones. How many people think A have a higher carbon footprint? Okay. How many people think B? Okay. I would agree with those that said B. And if we think about the life cycle analysis, to manufacture B, we need raw materials like precious metals and minerals, which have a high carbon footprint to extract. When we think about the use phase of the life cycle, we're constantly charging our pods, which requires more energy and has a higher carbon footprint. And when your phone is on Bluetooth connected to another device, your phone is also using more energy. And if we think of the length of the product life cycle, the pods don't last as long because we lose them, the battery breaks, and as a result, we need to replace them more often. So I'm gonna just speed past here to my last question. We've got two t-shirts, okay? If we think about the life cycle analysis, which is just really simple, manufacturing, shipping, use, end of life, the manufacturing emissions are 2.1 kilograms of CO2 emissions for t-shirt A, and for B, it's 5.3. Between the two, which is better for the environment? How many people say A is better for the environment? A? Okay. She's looking at me like, How many people say B is better for the environment? And getting some skeptical emoji faces. Well, if I were to answer this question, I would say, well, I need more information. The media loves carbon footprint. We talk about it a lot, but to really assess environmental impact, we need to know the water footprint, the waste footprint, the land footprint as well. So keep that in mind as consumers. And I'm gonna leave you with our famous phrase at Clever Carbon: what gets measured gets changed. Thank you for being here.